Tonight, we begin with a collision that Senate leadership had anticipated, dreaded, and ultimately failed to prevent. A floor confrontation that unfolded not over weeks of careful negotiation, but in a single explosive afternoon. An afternoon that shattered months of fragile bipartisan cooperation. An afternoon that exposed fault lines within the Republican Party that may never fully heal. An afternoon that will be studied in political science courses for decades to come. What the hardline Republican faction did today crossed a line that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell had hoped would hold through the election cycle. And when that line broke, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer did not hesitate. He responded with speed, precision, and a willingness to deploy procedural weapons that have rarely been seen on the Senate floor. Within hours, the chamber had transformed from a deliberative body into a political battlefield. Senators who had worked together for years refused to make eye contact. Staff members were seen openly weeping in hallways. And when the final vote was tallied, something unprecedented happened. A sitting United States Senator threw his prepared remarks to the floor and walked out of the chamber without a word. This is not normal. This is not how the Senate is supposed to function. And tonight, we're going to walk you through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it means for the future of American foreign policy. For months now, there had been rumblings, not official statements, not press releases, just rumblings that a faction of Republican senators was preparing something unprecedented. The Republican conference has been divided, yes, but they have been predictable in their divisions. Their internal conflicts have followed a certain pattern, a choreography, almost a theatrical routine. The hardliners object. Leadership negotiates. Compromises emerge. Votes proceed. But what set off alarm bells in Democratic leadership offices last week was that the pattern suddenly changed. Congressional observers who monitor legislative activity know the indicators. The private caucus meetings that suddenly go off the official calendar, the communications between offices that shift from email to in-person conversations, the lobbyist meetings that get canceled without explanation, the sudden disappearance of the usual background briefings to friendly reporters. All of that went quiet. And whenever Capitol Hill goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. What we now know is that during this period of unusual silence, a group of 12 Republican senators was meeting privately in what sources describe as an undisclosed location outside the Capitol complex. These weren't junior members. These weren't backbenchers with nothing to lose. These were committee chairs, appropriations subcommittee leaders, senators with decades of combined foreign policy experience, and they were planning what one aide later described as a complete reset of the Ukraine debate. Their goal, we now understand, was nothing less than forcing a fundamental reconsideration of American involvement in the conflict. Not through legislation, not through committee hearings, but through procedural obstructions so comprehensive that it would grind the entire Senate to a halt. Early this morning, Senate floor staff detected what they described as a coordinated procedural insurgency, including objections to unanimous consent requests that had not been raised in over 2 decades. These are the kinds of parliamentary maneuvers that senators only deploy when they are signaling something very specific. A complete breakdown in good faith negotiation, a willingness to sacrifice institutional norms for political objectives, or a fundamental disagreement so profound that normal legislative processes cannot contain it. Floor managers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the holdout faction was changing its approach entirely, and when a legislative minority shifts strategy without warning, even by a handful of votes, the entire Senate grinds to a halt. The first sign came at 9:47 when Senator Mike Lee of Utah rose to object to a routine motion to proceed. This was not unusual in itself. What was unusual was what happened next. Senator Rand Paul immediately rose to second the objection. Then Senator Tommy Tuberville, then Senator Ron Johnson, then Senator Jay. One by one, 12 Republican senators rose to register objections to what should have been a procedural formality. The presiding officer, visibly confused, called for a brief recess. That recess lasted 4 hours. The statement issued by Majority Leader Schumer when the Senate reconvened was not normal. It was not routine. It was not diplomatic. It was a declaration of procedural war. Schumer described the Republican faction's tactics as unprecedented, dangerous, and perhaps most significantly, a gift to Vladimir Putin wrapped in the American flag. But obstruction works if leadership hesitates. Schumer did not. In fact, his response today was among the most aggressive uses of majority power we've seen in the modern Senate. Here's what we know. Within minutes of the recess ending, Schumer filed closure on 17 separate motions simultaneously. These weren't the standard procedural moves we typically see. These were what Senate parliamentarians call nuclear options tools that the majority leader only deploys when preparing to fundamentally restructure how the chamber operates. The message was clear. If Republicans wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And it was going to happen on Schumer's terms, not theirs. The Republican holdouts had calculated that Schumer would back down. They had assumed that Democrats facing a difficult election cycle would choose accommodation over confrontation. They were wrong. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Schumer's procedural counterattack targeted every major piece of pending legislation, including the Ukraine aid package that had been scheduled for routine passage tomorrow. Democrats moved before Republicans could consolidate their position. They filed closure on the Ukraine supplemental. They filed closure on the government funding extension. They filed closure on the judicial nominations that had been pending for months. In other words, Democrats targeted the entire Republican legislative agenda. Every priority, every carefully negotiated compromise, every deal that Republican leadership had promised to their members, all of it was now at risk. This is what made the confrontation so explosive. The Republican holdouts' gambit wasn't just affecting Ukraine aid, it was threatening everything Republicans hoped to accomplish before the election. And Schumer, understanding the stakes, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not emotionally, but strategically. He didn't attack individual senators. He didn't engage in personal recriminations. He simply made clear that obstruction would have consequences for the obstructors, consequences for their colleagues, consequences for the institution itself. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Political analysts now believe that the Republican holdouts gambit was designed to test the durability of bipartisan Ukraine support after months of eroding public enthusiasm. They wanted to see whether Democrats would sacrifice the aid package to avoid a broader confrontation. But instead, the opposite happened. Democrats didn't retreat. They escalated with a response so comprehensive, so immediate, that even Mitch McConnell took notice. You don't get McConnell's attention easily. The man has seen every parliamentary maneuver in the modern playbook, but today Chuck Schumer surprised him. Republican strategists speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described the Democratic response as unprecedented in its speed and scope, a complete rejection of the notion that obstruction would be tolerated. But Democrats proved today that they remain both capable and willing to fight. Their procedural moves were not only aggressive, they were calibrated so precisely that they left Republicans with no good options. That precision matters because it shows preparation. It shows that Democrats anticipated this confrontation. It shows that they had wargamed the possibilities. It shows that Chuck Schumer is not merely reacting to events, he is shaping them. As reports continued coming in throughout the afternoon, we learned more about the scale of the Senate confrontation. Democratic whips carried out an emergency caucus meeting, securing commitments from all 50 Democratic senators plus independents to maintain absolute unity. Republican leadership targeted wavering members of the holdout faction, peeling off 3 senators who had initially joined the obstruction effort. Senate staff operating behind the scenes reportedly drafted 17 separate procedural motions, each designed to counter a specific Republican tactic. This wasn't just a legislative dispute. This wasn't just a policy disagreement. This was institutional combat. This was the Senate at war with itself. And institutional warfare is the one thing the Senate was designed to prevent. The founders created this chamber specifically to cool the passions of the moment, to force deliberation, to require compromise. But today, those guardrails failed. For every move Republicans made, Democrats countered with something more aggressive. For every procedural objection, there was a procedural response. And by late afternoon, the Senate floor had become something it was never meant to be, a zero-sum battlefield where victory required the complete defeat of the other side. Remember, the Republican holdouts thought this would be easy. They thought Democratic leadership would prioritize institutional comedy over policy outcomes. They thought the election cycle would make Democrats risk averse. They thought Ukraine fatigue among the American public would give them political cover. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Democratic leadership is prioritizing policy outcomes over institutional comedy. The election cycle is making Democrats more aggressive, not less. And Ukraine, rather than becoming a political liability, has become a symbol of American resolve, one that Democrats are determined to protect. The historical parallels are striking. In 1987, Senator Robert Byrd faced a similar obstruction effort from Republican senators attempting to block a judicial nomination. Byrd's response was legendary. He ordered the sergeant at arms to arrest absent senators and physically bring them to the floor. We're not quite there yet, but we're closer than we've been in decades. What makes this moment so volatile and so consequential is that the Republican confrontation happened at a time when Speaker Mike Johnson is under extraordinary pressure from his own conference. House MAGA members want complete opposition to Ukraine aid. Senate Republicans want a negotiated compromise. Republican donors want stability and predictability. Republican voters, according to recent polling, are divided almost evenly on the question. Speaker Johnson is balancing these demands while facing the constant threat of a motion to vacate his position. And when leaders in that position see their Senate colleagues engaging in procedural warfare, they don't see opportunity. They see danger. They see the possibility that Senate chaos will spread to the House. They see their own position becoming even more precarious. This is why Johnson's office was notably silent throughout today's confrontation. They issued no statements. They offered no support to the Senate holdouts. They simply watched, and their silence spoke volumes. The White House statement, released within hours of the Senate confrontation, was designed to signal that the administration would not accept indefinite delay of Ukraine assistance. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said plainly that the Senate obstruction was inconsistent with the urgent national security needs of the United States and our allies. That is diplomatic language for get your act together or we will make this a major campaign issue. You don't usually hear that tone from the White House when addressing members of the opposing party in Congress. But these are not usual times. The administration has been increasingly frustrated with the pace of Ukraine assistance. They have watched as weeks of delay translated into real consequences on the battlefield. They have seen Ukrainian soldiers die because ammunition didn't arrive in time, and they are no longer willing to wait. You don't usually hear that tone from the White House when addressing members of the opposing party in Congress, but these are not usual times. They have seen Ukrainian soldiers die because ammunition didn't arrive in time, and they are no longer willing to wait. Meanwhile, Majority Leader Schumer addressed the Senate in a forceful emotional speech this evening. He said, "What we witnessed today was not conservative principle. It was not fiscal responsibility. It was capitulation to Vladimir Putin dressed up as America First patriotism." He said, "Every day we delay is a day that Russian artillery kills more Ukrainian civilians. Every hour we waste is an hour that Putin's forces advance. Every procedural objection is a gift to the Kremlin." And he said, "I did not come to the United States Senate to watch this institution be used as a tool of Russian foreign policy, and I will not stand by while it happens." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a majority leader who understands that his legacy and the legacy of this Senate will be defined by what happens next. The stakes are that high. The moment is that significant. And Schumer, for better or worse, has chosen confrontation over accommodation. Here's what makes the situation even more complicated. The Senate confrontation wasn't isolated. Along with the procedural obstruction on the floor, House Republicans simultaneously announced new investigations into the Biden administration's Ukraine policy. Conservative media launched coordinated attacks on Republican senators who voted for previous Ukraine aid packages. Outside groups began running advertisements in primary states, targeting what they called rhino senators who support the aid. all of this happened within the same 24-hour window. When a political movement coordinates multiple pressure campaigns simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. This isn't just about Ukraine anymore. This is about the future direction of the Republican Party. This is about whether the traditional Republican commitment to strong national defense will survive the MAGA era. This is about whether American foreign policy will remain predictable and consistent, or whether it will become hostage to domestic political battles. The answer to those questions will be determined in large part by what happens in the Senate over the next several days. Congressional observers are now considering several possibilities. One is that the Republican holdouts will back down, having made their point and demonstrated their ability to cause chaos. Another is that they will continue their obstruction, forcing Democrats to deploy increasingly aggressive procedural responses. A third possibility, the one worrying Democratic leadership the most, is that the confrontation will spread to other issues, creating a complete legislative breakdown that lasts through the election. But today, Chuck Schumer took the most dangerous option off the table. He didn't accommodate, he didn't negotiate, he didn't offer concessions. He showed that obstruction would be met with overwhelming response. And in doing so, he changed the calculus for every senator considering joining the holdout faction. What we're watching now is a test of institutional resilience. The Republican holdouts want to see whether they can reshape American foreign policy through procedural obstruction. Democratic leadership wants to show that such tactics will fail. Traditional Republican foreign policy hawks want to prevent their party from abandoning its historic commitments, and the White House wants to ensure that American support for Ukraine remains durable, regardless of domestic political fluctuations. All of these interests collided today on the Senate floor, and the collision was spectacular. Tonight, we've heard from senior Democratic aides who are now monitoring the situation on an hourly basis. They say the procedural confrontation is expected to continue for at least the next 48 hours. They say backup plans are being prepared for every possible Republican response. And they say the holdout faction's decision to escalate is likely part of a broader strategy to force concessions on unrelated issues, including border security and domestic spending. But Democrats are not backing down. In fact, Democrats are preparing for an extended fight. Their response today, swift, unified, and overwhelming, sent a message to Republican holdouts that obstruction will not be rewarded. And it sent a message to the international community that American democracy, whatever its internal tensions, remains capable of producing outcomes when the stakes are high enough. As the evening progresses, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the Republican holdouts hope to achieve, but what we do know is that the Democratic response was timely. It prevented the complete collapse of the Ukraine aid timeline. It demonstrated that the majority party remains capable of unified action. And it established a precedent that will shape Senate dynamics for years to come. What happens next will depend on what the holdout faction does in the coming days. If they retreat, this moment will be remembered as a failed gambit that ultimately strengthened bipartisan Ukraine support. If they persist, Democrats have already shown they are prepared for extended combat. They have shown they have the votes. They have shown they have the will. They have shown they are ready to fight for as long as it takes. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Republican holdout faction appears to be uncertain. Their offices are quiet. Too quiet. And when Capitol Hill is quiet after a major confrontation, it means people are recalculating. It means they are reassessing their position. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight the hardline faction learned something they should have known already. Chuck Schumer does not bluff. The Democratic caucus does not fracture under pressure, and the Senate, when pushed to the brink, has ways of pushing back. This story is far from over. The votes have not yet been cast. The final outcome remains uncertain. But tonight, one thing is clear. The Senate is at war with itself. The future of American foreign policy hangs in the balance, and the next 48 hours will determine whether the world's greatest deliberative body can still deliberate, or whether it has become just another battlefield in America's endless political civil war. We will be here watching every vote, every motion, every speech as the next phase unfolds. Because tonight the Senate didn't just clash over Ukraine aid, it clashed over what kind of country America wants to be. And that question, more than any procedural motion, is what makes this moment so consequential.